Extraordinary honor to welcome Nancy Horan to Books and Books and to Miami. I encountered Ms. Horan's first word of historical fiction, Loving Frank, when working here a number of years ago, and it was tops on the New York Times bestseller list. I was familiar with Frank Lloyd Wright as a pioneer of modern architecture, but knew nothing about his private life. I read the book with gusto, not knowing that at the end I should have fastened my seatbelt. What I adore about historical fiction is that it allows a good writer to go beyond the dry facts and with exquisite research bring the characters to life. In this case, Nancy Horan is greater than good. She is exceptional. Now, one of the many perks of working at Books and Books is to have access to advanced readers' copies. They're free. I saw, as I perused one day the unpublished books, Nancy Horan's Under the Wide and Starry Sky, and eagerly grabbed it. As you see, I have no guilt about writing all over a book. I love it when it's a galley. I mean, it's free. Okay. Having had a challenging academic education, I was made to memorize poetry. Under the Wide and Starry Sky rang a bell. I was to discover these familiar words in a Stevenson poem on page 159 of Ms. Horan's book, Under the Wide and Starry Sky, and I would like to read it. Under the wide and starry sky, dig the grave and let me lie. Glad did I live and gladly die, and I laid me down with a will. This be the verse, you grave for me. Here he lies where he longed to be. Home is the sailor, home from the sea, and the hunter home from the hill. These words are engraved on Stevenson's memorial on the highest peak of Samoa, where he is buried along with his wife, Fanny. Theirs was a fascinating love story set in the 19th century. Robert Louis Stevenson was emotionally impulsive, chronically ill from infancy, with a great wit, though, and a light which shone brilliantly on his literary colleagues. Fanny was modern for her day. She was an artist, a writer, an adventuress, divorcee, and also a cougar. Here is Nancy Horan to tell you more. Thank you.
Thank you, Darby. Well, I love being here. I was here 6 years ago for Loving Frank in this very room. And there was some kind of festival going on or special event that night at Books and Books. And there were couples here out in the courtyard. And the women had given the men a book, and the men had given the women a rose. Does anybody know what that was about? What is it? Ah, it was. Oh, fabulous. It was incredible. So tonight, when I was leaving my hotel, I said to the doorman, I want to go to Books and Books. Can you give me the directions? And he said yes. And then he said, it's a very romantic place. And I thought, well, that is really a great, tagline you should use or something. Here I am talking about Robert Louis Stevenson and Fanny Vandergrift Osborne. Who knew 6 years ago that they would enter my life and come live with me, and I would end up with a dog named Louis after Robert Louis Stevenson. That was his middle name, and that was the name his friends and family called him, actually. This is a love story, as you heard, and a quite dramatic courtship. And I would love to go back to a particular moment in Robert Louis Stevenson's life that was a real turning point for him. When he set out from England at the age of 28, almost 29, to make a journey to the United States. He was a very eccentric young man, eccentric looking. He favored black velvet jackets and little smoking caps, embroidered smoking caps, and he might wear a big red sash around his middle. And he was bohemian, as his friends were. And he was carrying a big, heavy carpet bag full of 6 heavy volumes of George Bancroft's History of the United States. And he was hauling that thing across the Atlantic and across America to California, which was about as practical as, well, it was absurd. But, you know, this was the kind of guy he was. He wasn't terribly practical at this point in his life. He kept it a secret that he was leaving. He did not tell his parents. He knew they would try to dissuade him, and he didn't tell his friends except for a couple of very close ones, because he knew they would try to talk him out of what he was about to do, which was to go to America seeking the hand of a woman he had fallen in love with in France. Well, there were big complications. She was 10 years older than he was, not to mention that she was married with children. And she was from the western United States, which his literary friends regarded as primitive and barbaric, to use their words. Her name was Fanny Vandergrift Osborne, and she was quite a figure, quite a character that he had fallen in love with in France. He was, there were other complications. He was not in great health. He had always been, had some bouts of sickliness. He was not published much yet. He was a travel writer mostly, and he had gotten a couple of things published, but he was in the very infancy of his a great career. And he was broke, essentially. He had a little bit of money, but he had tried to borrow money from friends, and they refused it because they didn't think he should go. He had reached a turning point in his life, though, and he had 2 big goals. One was to win the hand of Fanny Vandergrift Osborne, and the other was to become a great writer and also a self-supporting writer who could also support her children once her divorce came through. So he made a plan. He planned to travel in steerage across the Atlantic and then get a train from New York to Monterey, California, which is where Fanny was living at the time. He disliked very much the class system he had been born into, and he wanted to write about a common man's perception of immigration at that time as he traveled by ship across the Atlantic. As it turned out, he went second class. A second class entitled him to a little desk where he could write. But other than that, he really was experiencing steerage. He wrote to a friend of his, Sidney Colvin, who eventually became his literary guide and great friend and helper. He wrote, "No man is any use until he has dared everything. I feel just now as if I had, and so I might become a man." Well, it was a do-or-die proposition when he left, and he very nearly died. There are 2 wonderful, poignant books, touching books that came out of that long journey, and I would recommend both of them if you ever would like to read his travel essays. The first, dealing with the ship voyage, is called The Amateur Emigrant, and the second is called Across the Plains. His romantic notions about the nobility of the common man were blasted apart on that emigrant train. He witnessed the basest behavior among the fellow passengers, but at times courage and grace and kindness from them as well. He earned the nickname Shakespeare because of his habit of continually taking notes in a little notebook. He described how there were three passenger cars on that train, one for the men, one for the women and children, and one for the Chinese passengers. He documented with sensitivity and outrage the indignities the Chinese passengers endured on that train. He remarked on the absurdity of the prejudices against them when he noted, "A while ago it was the Irish. Now it is the Chinese that must go, such is the cry. For my own part, I could not look but with wonder and respect on the Chinese." He said their forefathers were studying astronomy before his own had begun to keep pigs. As it turned out, Stevenson became extremely ill on that voyage. And that was when he decided he needed to write an epitaph for himself because he had kept it such a secret. He thought he might die and be buried on the plains. And that's when he wrote Under the Wide and Starry Sky. And it later got finished as a poem, but he began it then on that voyage. Well, I happened upon the story of Fanny and Louis while I was visiting in the Monterey Bay area. And it was there that he stayed after his grueling journey. And he also lived in San Francisco. He lived in Oakland for a while, waiting out a year in hopes that Fanny's divorce would go through. He was a literary giant in the 19th century. He was translated into many languages. He was beloved around the world. But by the 20th century, really, we had a sort of a narrowed view of who he was. People come up to me and they just start blurting out verses from A Child's Garden of Verses because, you know, we heard it as children and we learned it. You know, if you say Long John Silver, people might envision a seafood restaurant. On the other hand, not a lot of people have read The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and yet we all understand the meaning of that in this true sense that Stevenson meant it when he published that story in 1886. It is about the duality, the possibility of both good and evil residing in the same soul. So that's his funny legacy. I was a lit major in college, so I had read some of his work, not a lot. But when I discovered that he had been living in Monterey, California, I really wanted to know more. And that's usually how it starts, and that's how I get hooked and obsessed, and pretty soon I'm a goner, and it's 5 years later. But it was Fanny, in particular, this woman that he had fallen in love with. I wanted to know about this American woman. I had no idea that he had pursued and married this woman. Well, I found when I read a couple of biographies, I discovered two real big personalities. He met his match in Fanny Osborne. And their life together, it turned out, was as hair-raising and adventurous as Stevenson's romantic novels like Treasure Island. They lived all over the world. So this novel, Loving Frank, was told from the point of view of Mae Mancini, and who was the mistress and lover of Frank Lloyd Wright. This story is told from 2 points of view. Half of it is from a male point of view. It's Stevenson's point of view, and half is from Fanny's. The idea being that as the story unfolds, you see different perspectives on what is actually happening in these historical events. So my husband, this is my second novel. How many of you read Loving Frank? Oh, good. Okay. And so my husband says he sees a pattern, of course. He says, I seem to be interested in writing novels about women who leave their husbands and embark upon affairs. I really honestly do not set out looking for that when I get interested in these stories. But in this case, I did find two really interesting adulterous women. What can I say? It is true that Fanny Osborne did leave her philandering husband, and with her 3 children in tow, she took them and went to Europe to study art, which was her way of getting away from a really bad marriage. And her husband continued to support them on a tight budget, but she did manage to go to Europe and study art. She had a teenage daughter who was very gifted, apparently, as an artist, and they had studied art together in art school in San Francisco. And it's also true that Mae Mancini, like the protagonist in Loving Frank, Fanny also embarked on an affair when she was still married. But the 2 women strike me as very different characters, and they're the pattern. The similarities tend to end, I think. Fanny was born in 1840. She married a man who went to fight in the Civil War. Mema was born 29 years later. So during that period, universities became coeducational, some of them, and women were able to attend university. Mema attended university. Mema got a master's degree, which was unusual in the 1880s, and 1890s. But she did. She became a language scholar. She translated for a Swedish feminist, and she was a feminist herself. But Fanny Vandergrift Osborne was not. She was a tomboyish Indianapolis girl from kind of a middle-class family. Her father owned a lumber business. And she got married when she was 17. She had her first child at 18. She was walking on stilts in her mother's garden when she met her young husband. So she was still childish, playing at childish games when she first met the young man she married, Sam Osborne. And at 24, she did something that I think reveals her character. She, her husband, after serving in the war, he went west to mine for silver. And he asked Fanny to follow him. He sent a piece of rock home that was streaked with silver. And so Fanny went in the only way possible in those days from Indianapolis to San Francisco. She took a train east. She caught a steamer that went down the Atlantic coast to the Isthmus of Panama, disembarked, took a train across the isthmus, caught another ship, a steamer, and went up the Pacific coast and disembarked in San Francisco with next to no money in her pocket. She then took a stagecoach with her daughter, and keep in mind she's got a 5-year-old child with her this whole time, and she took a stagecoach to Nevada. And proceeded to live in a mining camp with her husband, 2 different Nevada towns, Austin and Virginia City. Fanny had grit. That's what she had. And she was game. She was really a game person. She was a bright person. She was also remarkably adventurous. She lived in those silver mining towns. She carried a pistol, rolled her own cigarettes. She could make furniture out of logs, and she did. She served barley coffee for Paiute Indians who came to her window of her shack when her husband was away. And Henry James knew both Fanny and he knew Robert Louis Stevenson. They were friends in Bournemouth, England, when they were all living there. And he said, if you like the gulch and the canyon, you will like Fanny. But I think she was more complicated than that. I think she was a woman of parts. She did know how to hammer together boards, but the thing was, Fanny had aspirations to be a writer herself. And, she was already working on short stories by the time she met Stevenson. She eventually did get published. She loved literature. She was a great storyteller. As a kid, she just held the neighborhood kids in thrall, telling them scary stories. She was a painter. You know, when she was studying painting, she was producing some respectable paintings. I just saw someone. I visited the Robert Louis Stevenson Museum in Napa, and if you haven't been there, consider going. It's a very tiny museum, but the places he wrote about in the Silverado Squatters, a book he wrote, another travel narrative, is, you know, all those places are there in Napa, and you can visit them, and of course stop at wineries along the way. She was a great gardener and a great photographer, and she also anticipated Photoshop by 130 years when she figured out how to paint the background in around her portrait so that her middle section looked smaller. And, you know, she was brave, to be sure. Brave, but she was also riddled with flaws. She was ambitious, and she had a hot temper. Her husband, Stevenson, called her a violent friend and a brimstone enemy. He also said marrying Fanny was the best thing he ever did. So we might not know about Fanny if she hadn't left her husband, but she did. She took those kids, she went to Europe, knowing that her marriage was irreparably broken. And she went first to Antwerp with her children and discovered that the school she had heard so much about, that she was excited about attending, did not accept girl students, female students. So she had to move on from there. And in her letters, she describes, I read her unpublished letters at UC Berkeley, and she describes going to this school, and the director of the school looked at her sample work she had brought and thought it was wonderful, and he said, why were you not born a boy? But anyway, she did go, and she went to Paris to a wonderful school, which was the Académie Julienne. It was run by a man who had classes for women separate from men. Part of the issue was drawing from the nude with classical training, and so it presented issues that Monsieur Julien solved quite readily. And it was a tremendously exciting time for women artists to be coming to Paris and studying with him, coming from Russia, Italy, all over Europe, and some very accomplished painters indeed. Louisa May Alcott's sister was one of the students at the same time that Fanny and her daughter were studying there. So it was a happy time for them. But tragedy struck Fanny's little family while they were there, profound tragedy. And I don't want to tell you what it is, and because I hope you will read the book and learn of it. But it staggered her. And she talked to her doctor, and he said, you need to go out into fresh air. Fresh air seemed to be the solution for everything in the 19th century. So she was told about a place called the Hotel Chevillon in Grès-sur-Loing, which is south of Paris. And that's where she went with her children, who were also grieving. And she was there for a number of weeks before the hotel was descended upon by a group of bohemian artists. And that was their place. And in fact, they had sent a scout when they heard from the hotel's owner, Madame Chevillon, that there was a woman and her brats at the hotel. They were so disgusted. Bob Stevenson, Robert Louis Stevenson's cousin, was just horrified that these people were going to be there. And so he went early to kind of talk them into going somewhere else, because his friends were all coming. And as it turned out, he befriended Fanny. So Stevenson always said that he fell in love with Fanny when he saw her through a window inside the Hotel Chevillon, and I think he probably did because he repeated it often enough. The woman he saw was an olive-skinned woman with wavy black hair, smoking a cigarette, moving her arms in a very animated way, very different from the Scottish girls that his parents had hoped he might marry. Fanny kind of resembled a Henry James character. You know, those women abroad characters, the American abroad in Europe. Well, that was Fanny. And who did he resemble? Who did Robert Louis Stevenson resemble? Well, he was surrounded by these bohemian artists, and his friend, a poet, William Ernest Henley, said of him, he wrote a poem about him about this time, and he said, in describing Stevenson, most vain, most generous, sternly critical, buffoon and poet, lover and sensualist, a deal of Ariel, just a streak of Puck, and of Hamlet most of all. So, you know, at the Hotel Chevillon, Stevenson was 26 years old. He was witty, he was hilarious, and he loved wordplay. His friends called him the Great Exhilarator because he could ratchet up the fun in a room so high that everybody would be hysterical, just having a great time. He was no innocent by the time he met Fanny Osborne, but he still had a real air of immaturity about him. And while Fanny found him exceptionally witty, he and his cousin Bob were always considered the best talkers in any room. And, you know, it was a time when conversation was an art form, and they were artists in terms of conversation. But even though he was as devoted as a puppy to Fanny, she found Robert Louis Stevenson to just be a little odd. And one of the problems, he was melodramatic. So, for example, if someone told a sad story, he might hurl himself on the floor weeping. Or if he started laughing, if he was highly amused, he would just get hysterical and start to choke. And so his friends knew what to do. They would just take his hand and bend it back as hard. Somebody's elbowing somebody else out in the audience. This is what you should do to her when she does it, okay? Bend the hand back. And that's what they did till he was in pain and he could stop laughing. Well, anyway, you know, despite their vast differences, they were so culturally different. You know, Stevenson was from Scotland, an only child. Fanny came from a family of, I think, 4 girls and 1 boy. Stevenson was a coddled and probably, you could say, a spoiled child. He was in full rebellion against his father. His father was a lighthouse builder. And he came from a famous family of lighthouse builders. And he had such high hopes that Lewis would become one too, and he didn't. And then as sort of a compromise, Lewis went to law school and didn't practice a day. Did finish law school, but he just was obsessed with the idea that he would be a great writer, and he was very intent upon it. So you can understand why he laughed a lot, because he was struggling with his father. He wanted to have fun. He was eager to have fun. He had spent a lot of time bedbound as a child, as you mentioned. And A Child's Garden of Verses, you know, it's poignant to read as an adult. I think it's for adults and children because, you know, you read it as an adult and you know that narrator is a kid who's in bed sick for much of the time. Well, they found common ground, Fanny and Lewis, and I think that his role when he met her was comforting her and helping ease the pain, and that is precisely the role she would play for him many, many times in the future. So they went to Paris. They spent another year together, It looked as they felt they were married to each other. It looked like they would, the path would be clear to marriage. Fanny was going to return and divorce her husband, and she took her children back with her to the United States in 1888. And then the letters tapered off. And it occurred to Lewis during the ensuing year that it was very possible Fanny had lost her resolve, and that, in fact, she had returned to her husband to try one more time to reunite with him. Well, the journey across America that I began with, which occurred 2.5, 3 years after he met Fanny, that worked. It was a great move on his part. He dared everything, and Fanny agreed to marry him. She dared everything by marrying a sick guy who had no reputation and no money. They married for love, really, and they spent their honeymoon in an abandoned mining shack on the top of Mount St. Helena in Napa. The Silverado Mining Company had left behind these empty shacks when the mines petered out, and I hiked up there recently when I was in Napa. I launched this book tour in Napa from the Stevenson Museum, and I went back, and I've been there before to the mining site. The cabins, the shacks are gone. There's a plaque there for Stevenson, but the great entrance to the mine is still there, and it's cracked. It's just this big crack in these rocks, it's exactly as Stevenson described it in the Silverado Squatters. But that's where they kept their milk and their meat, inside that cool, shaded part of the mine opening. I could imagine their encampment, and Fanny actually did hammer together boards to make a door, and she stretched cotton over the windows, and she yanked out poison ivy growing through the boards, and she started cooking and fattening up her husband. And they were happy times for them because her son was with them, her son Lloyd, and going forward they would always live together, as would Fanny's daughter come to live with them, with her husband and her own child. They would come, and they lived as an extended family together for many years. The quest of their lives then, the great focus of their lives together as married people was to find air, to find a way, a climate, a way for Stevenson to regain his health as best he could. And they traveled from place to place. He stayed in Davos, Switzerland, trying to recover at a TB sanitarium there. He did the same thing in Saranac, New York at one point. They traveled to France. They lived in different places in France, a couple of different places. And I visited many of them during the research process. I'm interested, I should say that sometimes people say I write about the unsung woman behind the famous man, and I think that's a very narrow way of describing what I'm trying to do here and who these women were. They were so much more than unsung women. They were full-blown characters, both of the women I've written about. And I love writing about real people and staying as true as I can to the real historical record, because history offers up stories that defy the imagination. And some stuff I couldn't even use because it was so incredible, you know. So, and both of my books have been about journeys. I take the journey with these characters. Once I've planned out the whole book, I start off with them, and it evolves as I go chapter by chapter. I know roughly where I'm going, but there are a lot of surprises along the way. There is a wonderful quote from Stevenson, and it goes this way: "Everybody, soon or late, sits down to a banquet of consequences." I think that describes why I like writing historical fiction. I have some distance, 100 years from these people. I can look at the choices they make, and I can observe the consequences of the choices they made. So part of it, of course, is just falling. For me, the research part is the most thrilling. Well, it's not more thrilling than writing, but it is pretty fun. And I fall into a vat of history, very narrow, very deep, and just get pickled. And I love it. I love it. It's so interesting to me. I do get lost. I do get off the subject. I do wander away and find myself reading about some obscure thing. But it all kind of works, I think, at some level, some unconscious level sometimes. I read biographies, but I also read original primary material, their letters, their diaries, some of which are quoted in the book. There's a piece of diary of Fanny's that was so heartbreaking. I felt I needed to really use that quote. And also quotes from, she published her diaries in a book called The Voyage of the Janet Nickel. And if you want to read an interesting book about their voyages in the South Seas, that's really a great book to read. They spent 2 years traveling in the South Seas because they found his lungs improved when he was at sea, in the sea air. Fanny was seasick every day. But she, she accompanied him in any case. And so in addition to all the reading to do, and I accumulated 100 books just by looking on the internet for old books nobody wanted, RLS and his Sine Qua Non, which was the title of a book by a woman named Adelaide Boodle. And she had been his little writing student when they were in Bournemouth, England. I mean, so many of these rare old books that I could get for $3, $4. Nobody wants them anymore. And they just informed so much this whole project. I visited many places, stayed in his boyhood home, but one place I visited that really there's nothing left there, and that was in Bournemouth, England. And that was where Henry James met them. Stevenson was quite ill. Stevenson was subject to lung hemorrhages. And when it occurred, he risked death. And so if there were signs, if he did have a hemorrhage thereafter, he wore his arm in a sling, his writing arm, so he would not be tempted to use his hand to write. And he formed a sign language, 3 fingers, 2 fingers meant this, for his wife. He couldn't talk during these periods. But when he was able, during their years in Bournemouth, he was a prolific writer. He produced enormous amounts of literature. And one of the things he produced was The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which, by the way, came after Treasure Island. Treasure Island was his first novel, and he wrote it for Fanny's son, Lloyd. That's how that came about. But with The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, he had a dream. And he woke, he was screaming in his sleep, and Fanny came in and said, "Wake up, what's the matter?" And he said, I was having just a terrifying dream. And she ran and got paper because he wanted paper, and he started writing. And he wrote for 3 days, 30,000 words. And as was the custom in their household, he read to her and to Lloyd when he was finished. And Lloyd loved the story, but Fanny was very quiet, and then she said, it should be a stronger allegory. It should be a much stronger allegory. It should be true of everyone, not only this particular character, but this duality should be true of all of us so that it makes us shiver with recognition. And Stevenson burned that manuscript, and for the next 3 days, he wrote another 30,000 words. And he was a literary athlete. He wrote, I can't count the number of short stories, something like 13 novels. He wrote travel narratives that are wonderful to read, essays. Just one I think of off the top of my head is On Falling in Love. And that's what he wrote after he met Fanny. So there are so many marvelous things of Stevenson's that we don't know about. And when they ended up in Samoa, he became really physically active, and he became able to participate as a member of the community, the Samoan community, and really a citizen. He was able to really become an activist against colonization in Samoa. He observed what was happening at the hands of the British, the Americans, and the Germans in Samoa at that time, and he wrote furious letters to the Times of London. His friends didn't understand it. They criticized him. They felt they had lost him completely, and he must have been very lonely at times to think that he could not leave that paradise because it was the one place on earth he seemed to thrive. Well, I think because of ill health, I think Robert Louis Stevenson, when he was ill, he had to reinvent himself as a healthy person, as a happy person every day that he was stuck in bed. And he was considered a romantic writer in his time. And there were many people who were realistic writers, and realism was taking hold and was becoming popular. Certainly in the 20th century it did, but in his time as well. And it annoyed Stevenson no end that there were people who celebrated pessimism as he saw it, and who gratuitously used sordidness in their work. He felt that was a disservice to the spirit of the people who were reading it, and particularly children. He wrote, "The true realism is that of the poets, to find out where joy resides and give it a voice beyond singing." Well, by the end of this project, I knew that I had met two remarkable people. Stevenson was just, I found to be a consummate storyteller. And at the end of his life, he was writing a book called The Weir of Hermiston, which is regarded as an unfinished masterpiece. He was a wonderful poet, too. He wrote music. If you have a chance, read his poetry. It's charming. And during his lifetime, he was admired by Henry James, but in the 20th century, when his reputation waned a bit, he was still much beloved and admired by Ernest Hemingway, Borges, Nabokov. Many, many writers emulated him, or at least said that they were inspired by him. In Fanny, I found a brave and inventive woman who struggled to keep her self-respect intact when she devoted her life to keeping him alive, and indeed she did keep him alive. She saved his life repeatedly. Some biographers have given Fanny a very hard time because she was thought to be overprotective of Louis, for example. She read Lancet Medical Magazine. She believed in germ theory before doctors did. Some doctors did. And she kept his ill friends away from him, and for that she was regarded as a scold and a difficult person. She was kind of the Yoko Ono of his crowd. But if she made enemies, Stevenson was not one of them. And I want to read to you, as I close here, a verse from a poem he wrote as a dedication to his wife for the Weir of Hermiston. And the poem is entitled, "To My Wife." "Take thou the writing, thine it is, for who burnished the sword? Blew on the drowsy coal, held still the target higher, cherry of praise and prodigal of counsel, who but thou? So now in the end, if this the least be good, if any deed be done, if any fire burn in the imperfect page, the praise be thine. Thank you. I bet you have questions. Anybody? Yes.
Well, as a writer of nonfiction, and you mentioned archival research, and I read your acknowledgments.
Yes.
For this book. I haven't read the book. And I'm very curious how you take archival research, which is, of course, near and dear to my heart.
Right.
And where the shift comes in your mind. I mean, I don't want you to teach me, 101 creative writing, but I'm just curious, if you're basing the book on archival research, where do you wander off telling a story that becomes fiction?
Well,
and I say that in all due respect. I'm just very curious.
I set out knowing I want to write the story in a narrative, fictional way. That's an understanding I start with. Rudyard Kipling said, if history were told as a story, people wouldn't forget it. And I think that there's some truth in that. That's not all the truth, but it's interesting truth. And so when I learned of this marriage and this relationship and this wonderful story, I thought there was value in knowing these people. And I view it as an opportunity to have a dialogue with extraordinary people, in a sense, to play with ideas. At one point I put Robert Louis Stevenson and Henry James in the same room, and they talked about identity. That's an example of what I do. Both of them touched upon the issue of identity and the unconscious. And so they were friends. They spent many, many hours together in the same room talking to each other. There was a special chair for Henry James in their house in Bournemouth. And he brought gifts to them. And Fanny was present during many of their talks. And it's entirely plausible that they would have talked about identity. That's where I take off. I know that Henry James visited their house some periods every day. So I have enough solid grounding there that I feel comfortable about making those suppositions. Dialogue, of course, is an opportunity to weave in what I know they were thinking, and also to speculate and to fictionalize, because it's a problem solver. Dialogue is, it's invented mostly. And what it does is it allows me to, I have to have in this room Henry James, Fanny, and Lewis, and they're in Bournemouth. That's the setting, and it may be winter or something. And, I have all these factors to think about. What are they saying to each other? What is going to move that plot along so that we're moving forward? And so a lot of that is, of course, fictionalized. So at what point do I break away is what you're asking. And I think there are just many, many places to do that. There are many places for interpreting the why. Biographers do that. They interpret. I'm doing the same thing. I draw my own conclusions from the historical record as well, just as a biographer would, because I think that biographies have a point of view very often, and so in a sense I'm presenting how I view the truth. Mine says fiction, a novel on the cover. I'm creating scenes, and I'm imagining the inner landscape and the emotions and that kind of thing. Does that help? Yeah. Yes.
Written about two extraordinary men. Any parallels?
I would say, well, there are parallels in the sense that Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, was regarded as an egotist and having an enormous ego. It was his focus and his dedication to his art that really allowed him to become what he did. And I think that's true of Stevenson, too. I think Stevenson was immersed in literature and in writing. And I think that because he devoted so much time to it, he managed to become a great artist himself. So those are parallels. Different personalities, quite different, I think.
One likable, one not so likable.
I hear people say that. One likable, one not likable. But, Frank Lloyd Wright had many friends and many admirers. And Stevenson was more obviously a humble man. And he really attempted to live a moral life. He was not a prude by any stretch of the imagination, but he wrote a lot about doing the right thing. So, different approaches in the way they presented themselves, for sure. Anybody else? Yes?
Yes, your title, I mean, there's so many, I'm sure, a lot of literary visions that could be put up in. How did you wind up with the title that you chose for your book?
Under the Wide and Starry Sky? Well, it was what I wanted for a long time, and I had to persuade some people that was a good idea. But, after I proposed it, then we came up with about 20 different titles or 30 different titles, and they get knocked around. And I just kept putting that title back in there. And so it turned out that it worked, and everybody liked it in the end. Kind of funny. With Loving Frank, oh my gosh, it went on and on. And Loving Frank actually is a title my husband invented. Yeah.
What was your working title for Loving Frank before people gave you some ideas? Did you have one?
I don't know that I had one, really. I don't remember. Maybe Mama and Frank. That's the easiest way to do it, is just to have something like that. And yes.
Are you working on another project now?
Am I working on another project now? In my head, I am. But I never tell. Not even my children for a very long time, because there might be a love story in there somewhere. I don't know.
I always wonder what's going to happen in the future, because you base so much research, you and others, on letters and written words, and
Yes.
they don't exist anymore now.
I think, did you all hear that? That's so true, that we don't write letters anymore, and I don't know what future historical fiction writers are going to do. Plow through emails. How literary are those? How literary are your emails? Okay. Mine are not. So yeah, I just think there are wonderful things about writing about the past. You have that long view, and it seems that you can write something sweeping and big because you have that perspective. They had such different difficulties than we do. I mean, just getting across the United States, that kind of thing. They were up against different problems, and yet I find that certain things resonate today as much as they did then. The fact that Fanny feared divorcing because she would be impoverished. There are women who have said to me, you get divorced today, you can be impoverished. Certainly with Mae Mancini and her whole situation, losing custody of her children and all that. Just divorce was a big problem in the 19th century. It was very difficult to get sometimes, and consequently, people stayed together often. And that was another interesting aspect about this story. I really felt like this story, I knew from the beginning this story was about a long marriage and a long relationship, and a relationship that abided and was rich with devotion. And it's kind of an old-fashioned, it exists today all over the place, but it was interesting to look at because they really endured thorny, rough times. It was not all roses at all. It was, Stevenson may have said it was, I can't remember, but he wrote a lot about marriage and how it was not a bed of roses all the time. But it was like one long conversation. And after a while, you sort of found yourself on the same page. He had just wonderful little insights about a long relationship. So I knew it was about that, but then all this other stuff came up through the facts, in between the facts, about identity and other themes.
Folks, we have time for 2 or 3 more questions. Looks like. Thank you very much.
Yes.
How long were they married?
They were married. Let's see. Their relationship. They met in 1875, and they married in 1880, and he died in 1894. Yeah.
So he died young.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Getting back to the research,
Mm-hmm.
you, assuming you read letters, writings from both Franny and Robert,
Mm-hmm.
and I find this to be true, when you're consistently reading someone's handwriting,
Mm-hmm.
which oftentimes, like 19th century handwriting, which can be so aesthetically pleasing, but
Mhm.
somewhat difficult to wade through, but then you get the cadence, you become so, familiar with that part of their lives that almost the writing
Mm-hmm.
becomes a physical, it becomes like it characterizes them so well, not just the word, but the actual line, the line weight, how they're writing, what they're writing on. I find that kind of fascinating.
That is interesting. I found both of their handwriting to be difficult to read on an extended basis, and I could see here and there, everything got translated into type on the part of Stevenson. There are 8 volumes of his letters, and there's another thing to read if you really get hooked on Stevenson. His voice. I like the letters for the voice. It's the closest you can get to. If there are no tape recordings of them, it's the closest you get to a voice. And Stevenson's voice was very modern. It's as if we were talking just like this to him. I mean, he is talking that way to us. It was charming. And he was pretty honest in his letters, I believe, although he did cover up certain aspects of his troubles. And with Fanny, at the beginning, her voice changed a lot depending on who she was writing to. So she was harder to nail down a little bit. Yeah.
The last question over here. Oh, wait. This lady in the second row has a question.
I wondered about the children. Would you say Franny was very fortunate to have been able to keep the children? Because in those days, I would think if the husband wanted the children, he would have.
Probably could have kept them, but he had quite a reputation. And actually, when Fanny left with the children, he moved his new lady love into their home. So it wasn't an issue. It was an issue with Mammaccini, to be sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for coming. That's great.
Signed books if you would like to purchase them.
Good. Okay.
It was wonderful.